It was supposed to be a quiet night. The kind of shift where nothing major happens, maybe a call about a stray dog, or someone locking their keys in the truck. Sheriff Paul Whitaker and his deputy, Miguel Reyes, had patrolled the same back roads of Meeker County for over a decade. Both men were familiar faces in the small town of Richland Falls, population just under 3,000. The kind of town where everyone waves when they pass you, and nothing ever really changes. Until that night. The two officers signed on duty just before dusk, driving out in the county cruiser like they always did. It was the first week of October, leaves just beginning to change, a cool bite in the evening air. Their last radio check-in was at 9:47 p.m. Routine traffic stop, mile marker 118 near the old service road leading into the hills. Nothing unusual in their tone. But after that call, silence. Total radio silence. Dispatch tried for 20 minutes to reach them. Then an hour. A second unit was sent out just before midnight. By sunrise, the cruiser was found abandoned on the shoulder of the service road. The keys still in the ignition. Driver's side door open. No signs of struggle, no blood, no broken glass. Just gone. Sheriff Whitaker was 52. A Vietnam veteran, father of 3, and known in town as the guy who fixed his own roof in the middle of a thunderstorm because he didn't want to pay a kid to do it wrong. He wasn't reckless, just self-sufficient. Miguel, his deputy, was 34. Originally from El Paso, he moved to Richland Falls after marrying a local schoolteacher. They were expecting their second child that winter. By all accounts, both men were grounded, professional, and deeply committed to the people they served, which made their disappearance hit that much harder. For the first few days, every able body in town joined the search. The community turned out in droves, flashlights in hand, calling out to the woods, praying they'd stumble across some clue, a boot print, a torn shirt, anything. The state police, K-9 units, helicopters, even volunteers from neighboring counties got involved. But after 2 weeks, hope started to thin out. Rumors crept in to fill the silence. Some folks whispered it had to be a cartel ambush. Others pointed fingers at survivalist camps rumored to exist deep in the hills. A few even muttered about the old mining tunnels from the 1800s that supposedly ran beneath the county. None of it added up. Over the years, theories came and went, but the case stayed cold. Families held on to photos and memories, and every October, a candlelight vigil would be held in the town square, right beneath the sheriff's memorial plaque. Still, nothing new ever came. Just the same two faces staring back from missing persons posters, yellowed and curling at the edges. 16 years passed. People aged. Kids grew up and moved away. And eventually, the story of the vanished sheriff and his deputy became more of a legend than a mystery. Something you'd hear about at the diner when the coffee was lukewarm and the conversation ran dry. But then, something happened. And it started with a man named Curtis Langley. Curtis wasn't anyone special in town. Retired truck driver. Moved to Richland Falls 2 years ago after inheriting a small plot of land from his uncle. The property sat on the far western edge of the county, untouched for decades, mostly overgrown, with a collapsed barn and a crumbling farmhouse. Curtis had no interest in fixing it up. His plan was to sell the timber rights and clear the place out. But while exploring the land one afternoon, looking for the old well his uncle once mentioned, he stumbled across a half-rotted wooden structure barely standing. It looked like an outhouse. The kind people used before indoor plumbing. Oddly intact, just hidden behind a thicket of wild blackberry bushes. What drew his attention wasn't the outhouse itself, but the smell. Curtis later told investigators it wasn't just decay. It was something sour, something wrong. He assumed it was a dead animal. Maybe a raccoon or possum had fallen in. He brought over some planks to pry the lid off, not expecting much. But what he uncovered would shake the foundation of Richland Falls to its core. Inside that outhouse pit were bones. Not animal bones. Human. 2 full skeletons, carefully wrapped in old military-issue tarps, preserved strangely well given the conditions. Curtis didn't touch anything after that. He called the sheriff's office, hand shaking, barely able to explain what he'd found. The property was quickly sealed off, and forensic teams were flown in from the state capitol. Word spread like wildfire, and within hours, townspeople were gathering near the police tape, asking questions no one was ready to answer. Dental records would later confirm what many already feared. The remains were those of Sheriff Paul Whitaker and Deputy Miguel Reyes. Both men had been shot execution style. The bullets still lodged in their skulls. Not a robbery, not a misadventure, cold-blooded murder. But here's where things got strange. The tarps they were wrapped in? Military-grade, Vietnam era. Exactly the kind Paul would have had access to during his service. One of the tarps had faint initials written in marker, PW. Some believed it meant he knew his killer, maybe even trusted them. And then there was the rope. Both men had their wrists tied behind their backs. A specific knot, one that only a few people in the area would know how to tie, a type often used in training exercises at the Sheriff's Academy back in the 80s. Even more disturbing was what wasn't found. No shell casings, no personal effects, no radios, no badges, nothing to trace who had done it. Whoever buried them had time. They planned it. They wanted them forgotten. The investigation reopened immediately, but time hadn't been kind to the evidence. Soil had shifted. DNA degraded. The only fresh lead was the location itself, on land once owned by Curtis's uncle, a man who passed away 10 years earlier and had no known ties to the sheriff's department. But buried in the county records, someone uncovered something curious. Back in the 1970s, that same property had been used as a temporary training ground for new recruits, including Paul Whitaker. Now, people started asking the question that had always lurked beneath the surface. Was this ever really about an ambush on the job? Or did someone close to them, maybe even inside law enforcement, want them silenced? And if so, what did Paul and Miguel know? The sheriff's department remains tight-lipped. But locals say the current sheriff, Angela Dorsey, who once trained under Paul, hasn't slept much since the discovery. She was seen leaving the outhouse site in tears. No press conferences. Just a promise, we will find who did this. But the deeper they dig, the more questions arise. The people who were around back then, who might know something, they're older now. Some are gone. Some might be hiding secrets they thought were buried forever. And others, well, they're just waiting to see what else turns up. Because this old outhouse didn't just give up the bodies. It might have opened the door to something much darker. And what they find next might change everything. In the days following the shocking discovery, Richland Falls felt like it was holding its breath. For the first time in 16 years, the town had something concrete. Sheriff Whitaker and Deputy Reyes weren't just names etched on a plaque or faded photos hanging in the station. They were victims of a calculated crime, hidden in the shadows just a few miles from the heart of the town. But the deeper everyone looked, the less sense it all made. Sheriff Angela Dorsey had been a rookie deputy when the men disappeared. Back then, she had idolized Sheriff Whitaker. He was the one who'd encouraged her to apply to the academy, even when others thought she didn't have the grit for it. Now, standing where their bodies were found, she couldn't stop replaying that last morning she'd seen him. He'd slapped a sticky note on her desk, teasing her about her slow paperwork, then headed out with Miguel for what should have been a normal patrol. They had planned to meet later that week to discuss her promotion. That meeting never happened. Angela hadn't slept much since the remains were identified. The discovery at the old outhouse hadn't just reopened the case, it had reopened old wounds. She pulled out every case file, every radio log, every tip that had come in during those first chaotic weeks back in 2009. Some reports had water stains. Others were barely legible, scrawled in rushed handwriting. But as she sifted through it all, one name kept showing up in the margins: Travis Bell. Back in 2009, Travis had been a part-time dispatcher, filling in night shifts when others were off. He was young, fresh out of high school, and always trying too hard to impress. Angela remembered him being eager but sloppy. He had reported hearing static interference the night Paul and Miguel vanished, but his statement was never taken seriously. A few weeks after the disappearance, Travis left town. No note, no goodbye. Just packed up and moved to Oklahoma. Angela made a note to have someone find him. Meanwhile, forensic experts were combing through every inch of the land where the bodies had been found. Ground-penetrating radar revealed what looked like an old concrete slab just 15 feet from the outhouse, possibly the foundation of a long-demolished shed. Investigators began digging. The soil was dense, packed with roots and rusted nails. But then, they found something odd: an old sheriff's department radio, broken in two, wrapped in plastic and buried inside a rusted toolbox. The serial number matched the unit assigned to Deputy Reyes. It raised more questions than it answered. Why bury the radio separately? Why preserve it, but damage it first? And more importantly, who had access to department-issued equipment and knew how to disable and hide it? Angela took the evidence back to her office, where she kept it sealed. She didn't want leaks. But people were already talking. Whispers grew in the corners of diners and gas stations. Some wondered if the killer was still in town, still walking among them. Others were more cynical, suggesting maybe Whitaker had uncovered something illegal back in the day and paid the price for it. Drugs? Dirty money? Land deals gone bad. The rumors spread faster than the facts. One of the oldest names to resurface was Billy Camp. Back in the 90s, Billy had been a troubled teenager who'd had more run-ins with the sheriff's department than anyone could count. Theft, fights, even arson. But Whitaker had given him chance after chance, even helped him get into a rehab program when others wanted to throw him in jail. After Miguel joined the department, it was said he took over that mentorship. Billy eventually cleaned up, moved out west, and started a construction company. But a year before Paul and Miguel vanished, Billy had returned to Richland Falls. No one knew why. Some said it was family issues. Others said he was buying up cheap land near the hills. That included a small parcel just a few hundred yards from where the outhouse stood. Angela found that purchase odd. Why would Billy, who had no known ties to that area and hadn't lived in town in years, suddenly buy land near an abandoned property? She pulled the deed records. Billy had bought it under a company named Black Creek Holdings, a shell business with no website, no public address, and no tax filings in recent years. Just a P.O. box in Tulsa. Angela flagged it and added it to her growing web of leads. But it wasn't just old names that raised suspicion. A retired deputy named Harold Finn, now in his 70s, came into the station unannounced one afternoon. He looked frail but determined. He sat down across from Angela and said, "I think I need to tell you something I should have said a long time ago." Back in the early 2000s, Harold said he'd seen something out in those hills while patrolling alone. A gathering of people at an old barn just past the service road. He didn't think much of it at the time, probably teenagers drinking, maybe squatters. But when he approached, he said he was stopped by another deputy who told him to let it go. That deputy was Ray Stokes, now deceased. According to Harold, Stokes had connections that went deeper than anyone in town realized. And he was one of the few people who could have gotten a patrol route changed without raising suspicion. Angela took down every word. She asked Harold why he didn't speak up sooner. He just looked down and said, "Because back then, I didn't know who I could trust." Later that night, Angela sat alone in her office, staring at the old corkboard covered in photos and maps. She marked the outhouse site, the location of the concrete slab, Billy's property, and the old barn Harold had mentioned. All of them formed a triangle within a tight radius. Too tight to ignore. She picked up her phone and called an old friend, a retired FBI analyst named Glenn Mercer who now lived in Dallas. Glenn owed her a favor. She asked if he could come up for a few days. She didn't say much over the phone, just that something old was starting to feel new again. Outside, the wind had picked up. Fall was settling in. The leaves rustled along the sidewalks, and a thin layer of fog crept across the hills. Somewhere out there, someone knew the full truth. Someone had kept it buried for over a decade and a half. But time had a way of shifting the ground. Old secrets didn't stay buried forever. And as Angela looked again at the faded photo of Paul and Miguel smiling, uniforms crisp, unaware of what was coming, she made a quiet promise to herself. No matter what it uncovered, this time they would not be forgotten. This time, the truth would come out. But the truth, she feared, might be far more dangerous than anyone was ready for. 2 days later, Glenn Mercer pulled into Richland Falls just after sunrise, his old SUV kicking up dust as he rolled past the city limits sign. He hadn't been back in nearly a decade, not since his niece's wedding. The town looked about the same, weathered brick buildings, quiet streets, and that strange mix of charm and stillness that only small towns seem to hold. But the moment he stepped into the sheriff's office and saw Angela's face, he knew this wasn't going to be a casual visit. She didn't even greet him with a handshake, just handed him a folder and said, "Start here." Inside were the crime scene photos. The skeletons. The tarps. The buried radio. and scribbled notes pointing to people Glenn didn't know but would soon have to understand better than they understood themselves. His experience with cold cases had taught him one thing. Small towns had long memories, but even longer silences. If someone here had killed those two officers and buried them in a forgotten outhouse, someone else knew, or at least suspected, something. And after 16 years, secrets had a way of slipping through the cracks. Angela updated Glenn over coffee. She told him about the odd land purchase under Black Creek Holdings, about the strange knot used to bind the bodies, about Harold Finn's visit, and what he said about Ray Stokes. Glenn jotted everything down, but it was the radio that caught his attention. You said the serial number matched Ray's unit, right? But the casing had no fingerprints, no prints at all. Angela nodded, clean as a whistle. It was wiped down and wrapped like someone knew it'd be found someday. That's not panic, Glenn said. That's planning. Meanwhile, across town, Miguel Reyes' widow, Sophia, stood in front of the TV in her living room, watching the local news rerun the Outhouse discovery for the third time that week. Her hands trembled, but not from shock. She was angry. For 16 years, she'd begged for updates, pleaded for answers. Now suddenly, the whole world wanted to talk. Reporters knocked on her door. Old neighbors called like they hadn't vanished from her life years ago. All of it was noise. But the hardest part was her son, David. He was almost 17 now. He barely remembered his father. Only the stories his mom had kept alive, stories about honor, duty, and loyalty. David had started asking questions again. Real ones. Do you think Dad knew who did it? Why would someone kill both of them like that? Did they ever talk about getting threats? Sophia didn't have the answers. She had theories. Everyone did. But saying them out loud made them real. Later that day, she got in her car and drove to the property where the bodies were found. The sheriff had posted warning signs and police tape, but she stood at the edge of the trees and stared through the gaps in the brush. Something about the place unsettled her, but it wasn't the violence that happened there. It was the quiet. Like the ground itself was still hiding something more. Back at the sheriff's office, Glenn asked for the original patrol logs from 2009. The ones from the week before the disappearance. Angela had to dig them out of the archives, faded pages, hand-typed notes, but still legible. Glenn's eyes scanned the logs carefully. A detail jumped out. On the night of the disappearance, Paul and Miguel had rerouted off their planned patrol to respond to a report of unusual activity near the hills. The call hadn't come through dispatch. It had come directly to the patrol unit on a private channel, Channel 9, which was typically used only for off-duty or emergency contact. Angela frowned when she saw it. That channel was supposed to be restricted, she said. Only a few of us had access to it. She began pulling records, trying to find out who was active on Channel 9 that night. But the logs were missing. Not just from that night, but the entire month of October 2009. Redacted. Filed under Archive Review. Glenn sat back in his chair. Someone cleaned house. Elsewhere in town, Curtis Langley, the man who had found the bodies, hadn't been sleeping well. Ever since the discovery, people had started looking at him differently. Whispers at the grocery store. Quiet stares at the gas station. As if just by finding the truth, he'd become part of the lie. He knew there were rumors. That maybe he hadn't found those bodies by accident. That maybe he knew more than he let on. But the truth was worse. He had seen something years earlier. He just didn't think it mattered until now. Back in 2011, while clearing brush near the same part of the woods, he'd found a small leather pouch buried under a tree. Inside were 3 deputy badges, 2 worn, 1 shiny and new. He'd assumed it was junk. Kids playing sheriff, maybe. He tossed the pouch in his shed and forgot about it. Now, with everything coming back, he went looking for it again. And found it. Tucked behind an old toolbox, dusty but still intact. He brought it to Angela without saying a word. She opened the pouch slowly. The first 2 badges matched Paul's and Miguel's design, but the third had a number she didn't recognize. It belonged to no one in their department. Not then, not now. Angela sent a request to the state records office for old badge assignments. When the answer came back, she didn't speak for a full minute. The badge had been issued to a deputy named Caleb North, a name she hadn't heard in years. Caleb had worked at the Richland Falls Department for less than a year in 2008. He left after an internal dispute involving a missing evidence locker key. Officially, he transferred to another agency. Unofficially, some thought he'd been fired quietly to avoid bad press. No one had spoken to him since. Angela pulled up what little information she had: an old address in Fort Worth, a driver's license that hadn't been renewed since 2014. His trail went cold fast. But if that badge was buried with Paul and Miguel's, he was somehow connected. Maybe he had been with them that night. Maybe he lured them out there. Glenn added Caleb's photo to the board. We've got 3 men on patrol that night. Only 2 come back. Then the pieces started clicking faster. The strange use of Channel 9. The missing logs. The military tarps. The special knot. The wipe-down radio. These weren't the actions of a random killer. They were the signs of someone who had training, access, and a reason to keep things quiet. Someone who knew the department from the inside. Someone who had help. Angela and Glenn knew they were circling something dangerous. Every step forward risked stepping on someone's toes, someone powerful enough, or desperate enough, to make sure this case had stayed buried for over a decade. And yet, all they had were fragments. A badge. A broken radio. A buried truth that still hadn't revealed its full shape. And then came the letter. It arrived in a plain white envelope, no return address, dropped in the mailbox at the sheriff's office. Inside was a single photograph. Black and white. Old, maybe taken with a disposable camera. It showed 3 men standing outside the old barn in the hills. One of them was Paul. Another was Miguel. And the third, partially obscured, wore a uniform, but his face was scratched out in ink. On the back of the photo were 5 words, written in blocky handwriting. You buried the wrong ones. Angela's fingers went cold. Glenn took the photo from her, eyes narrowing. The photo wasn't just a threat. It was a clue. Someone still out there didn't want the truth coming to light. And someone else was ready to make sure it finally did. Angela stared at the photo for a long time, her hands stiff from holding it too tight. The message on the back felt like a slap. You buried the wrong ones. It wasn't just a threat. It was someone saying, you're looking in the wrong direction. She glanced over at Glenn, who had gone silent. His mind was already breaking it apart, analyzing, rewinding. But Angela didn't need analysis. She felt it in her gut. This was someone close. Someone who knew Paul and Miguel, who had access, time, and a reason to keep a secret alive this long. They blew up the photo, pinned it to the board. Miguel's smile looked forced in it. Paul's arm hung loose at his side. Neither of them looked comfortable. It was a candid moment, caught just before something happened. The barn behind them, weathered, with a collapsed roof, was in that stretch of land Harold Finn had mentioned. Glenn marked the location on the map. It was off Old Deerfield Road, behind a series of service trails. The land was now owned by the state, but it hadn't been touched in years. Angela ordered a quiet search, unmarked vehicles, no press. The team found tire tracks, even though no vehicles had been reported in that area in months. Fresh prints in the dirt, cigarette butts near the door, and inside the barn, burnt matches, scraps of newspaper from just 2 weeks earlier. Someone had been camping out there, watching. But it wasn't just someone returning to the scene. It felt like someone waiting for them to find it. On the far wall, behind a loose board, one of the deputies uncovered a second photo. This one was newer. It showed the same spot where the bodies had been found, except in this image, the hole hadn't been dug yet. Just the undisturbed outhouse. The photo was taken from a distance, like someone had been documenting the area long before Curtis stumbled across it. Angela drove back to town with her jaw clenched. Every step forward felt like it was being guided, like they weren't solving a case, but playing someone else's game. At the station, Glenn said what she'd already been thinking. Someone's been planting this. Bit by bit. They want us to dig, but only in the direction they choose. That night, as a cold front rolled through and wind rattled the window panes, Glenn stayed behind in the office. He rechecked every file, every photo. At around 2:30 a.m., a ping came through the system. A match on the name Caleb North. A speeding ticket in northern Arkansas, just 6 days ago. The officer who pulled him over hadn't known the name meant anything. Caleb gave a fake address, but paid the fine on the spot, in cash. Glenn printed the record. The signature on the citation matched a signature from a 2008 department report almost exactly. The next morning, Angela assembled her team. They kept it quiet. No media, no chatter over open channels. Just 3 unmarked units heading toward the Arkansas state line. But when they arrived at the motel listed on the ticket, Caleb was already gone. Room cleared, bed stripped, bathroom spotless. Except for one thing. A single photo, left face down on the pillow. Angela picked it up with gloved hands. It was another image of the barn. This time, a man stood just inside the doorway. His back was turned, but something about his stance seemed familiar. Glenn looked over her shoulder and muttered, "That's Paul." But Angela wasn't so sure. The figure was bulkier, the stance more rigid. She had seen that same shape 100 times on patrol, in old department photos, in the way someone carried themselves with authority. "No," she said slowly. "That's Whitaker." Back at the station, everything started to shift. Angela couldn't shake the feeling they had all misunderstood something basic. Everyone had assumed both Paul and Miguel were victims. But the evidence now suggested there was another layer, someone else in that barn, someone not buried in the ground. In that photo, the way the figure stood like he didn't know the picture was being taken. Like he thought he was alone. While Glenn focused on the image, Angela dug into Whitaker's old cases. Not the big ones. The minor calls. Property disputes, neighbor complaints, trespassing reports. And there it was, an incident from 2007 involving a dispute over land zoning near the same area the barn stood. The complaint was filed by a woman named Leanne Carter. Angela remembered the name vaguely, but what caught her wasn't the complaint. It was the handwritten note in the margin, settled off the books. No follow-up required. That note had been written by Ray Stokes. Angela tracked Leanne down. She now lived in San Antonio and worked at a community college. The phone call was awkward at first, but when Angela mentioned Whitaker, there was a pause. "He promised me it was over," Leanne said. "He told me they would stop coming around." "Who?" Angela asked, but Leanne didn't answer right away. There was a long silence. Then, carefully, she said, "There were 3 of them. They'd meet out at that barn. I thought it was about the land. But one night I heard shouting. And later, I saw them dragging something into the trees." "Did you report it?" "I tried," she said. "But when I called the station, I was told there was no record of my complaint. That I must have called the wrong department. I knew then that someone didn't want it on paper." Angela hung up and stared out the window. The edges were closing in. The truth wasn't just about a killing. It was about a group, something organized. A circle of people who'd buried something big in those woods. Maybe a crime. Maybe a body. Something that Paul and Miguel got too close to. Something that Whitaker had tried to cover or stop. And now someone was peeling it back, piece by piece. Late that night, David Reyes sat alone in his bedroom, laptop open, headphones in. He'd been reading everything he could find. News articles, old Reddit threads, old message boards discussing his father's case. Then something odd caught his eye. An old post from 2014 on a now-deleted forum about strange patrol patterns in Richland Falls. It mentioned seeing 3 sheriff units parked near the hills at midnight, long after patrol should have rotated. The post was anonymous, but the location pinned matched the trailhead where Curtis later found the bodies. David copied the image from the post and zoomed in. 3 patrol cars, and faintly visible in the background, a 4th person on foot, walking toward the woods. He zoomed again. The quality was poor, but there was something off. The person wasn't in uniform. The photo was time-stamped. October 23, 2009, exactly one day before Paul and Miguel vanished. David sent the image to the sheriff's office anonymously, using a VPN. But he left one hint in the message. They were followed. The email arrived at 3:17 a.m. Angela read it as the thunder rolled in, shaking the old window panes of the station. The timing wasn't lost on her. Whoever sent this knew exactly when to strike, when everyone was tired, stretched thin, questioning what they thought they knew. She turned to Glenn, her voice quiet. "We're not chasing one killer. We're chasing the shadows of men who disappeared before the crime even happened." And just as the lights flickered from the storm outside, the phone rang. An officer's voice on the other end, nervous, shaken. "We found another grave." Angela's breath caught in her throat. "Where?" The voice answered, "Near the barn." "And Sheriff, this one wasn't buried 16 years ago." Angela dropped the phone without realizing it. The words echoed in her ears. This one wasn't buried 16 years ago. Her heart pounded as she grabbed her coat, Glenn already halfway out the door. Rain slashed sideways through the dark morning air as they raced down the back roads to the barn. Flashing lights bounced off tree trunks and soaked grass as 3 cruisers stood huddled near the edge of the woods. Deputies stood back, pale-faced and quiet. The grave wasn't deep. Whoever dug it hadn't cared much about hiding it. The soil was loose, turned recently. Angela knelt beside it, eyes scanning the scene. A single, black trash bag had been partially uncovered, the corner of a denim sleeve poking through the slit in the plastic. The smell was still fresh. Glenn knelt beside her, peeled the bag open just enough to glimpse the face. It wasn't someone they recognized. Male, late 40s. Shot once in the chest, execution style. No wallet. No ID. But there was something oddly familiar: calloused fingers, a sheriff's department tattoo half faded on the forearm. Angela turned away, rain dripping from her hair, mind racing. Back at the station, while the forensic team processed the body, Glenn pulled up every employee record from the early 2000s. If the tattoo was real, it meant the man was once part of their department. Angela stared at the board on the wall: badges, faces, timelines. Then she spotted something. A deputy named Alan Hurst. Quiet. Reassigned in 2008 to another county. But the record ended there. No forwarding contact, no job references, no pension trail. Just a name that disappeared. Angela typed faster. She searched old housing records, credit reports, anything. Finally, a hit. A storage unit rented under Alan Hurst's name, just outside of Millitown. It hadn't been accessed in over 3 years. She and Glenn were on the road within the hour. The unit was damp, the smell of mildew thick in the air. Boxes lined the shelves, and in the far back corner was an old filing cabinet, locked. Glenn popped it open with a crowbar. Inside were case files, most faded and stained. But tucked behind them was a worn journal. Pages filled with small, scribbled handwriting. Names, dates, places. And in the center of it all, a note. They think it's buried for good. But not all of us were okay with what happened. They read through it in silence. Alan had written everything, in bits and fragments, but the message was clear. Back in 2008, Whitaker had been involved in a secret investigation of land use, possibly connected to a private security firm with military ties. The land out near the barn had once been used as an off-the-books training site. The local department wasn't just patrolling it, they were guarding it. Alan had grown uneasy. He wrote about a conversation he overheard between Whitaker, Ray Stokes, and another unnamed deputy. Something had gone wrong, a fight, a cover-up, and someone disappearing. Alan never said who, but he feared being next. That's when he quit. Now he was dead, murdered, dumped in the very place he once protected. Angela felt the walls close in. This wasn't just a case of 2 missing officers. It was deeper. Layers of secrets, of betrayals that stretched across years. And someone was cleaning up loose ends before the truth came out. At that same time, back in Richland Falls, David Reyes was sitting in his father's old study. After the news of the new grave broke, Sophia had handed David a shoebox. "I didn't want you seeing this until you were old enough," she said. Inside were notebooks, letters, and a cassette tape. His dad's voice, Miguel's voice, recorded from an old dictaphone he used to carry on patrol. David sat frozen as the tape played. "I think Whitaker's been lying," Miguel's voice said. "Something's off about how they're rerouting calls. Paul's worried too. If something happens to us, I want someone to know we were watching. We were getting close." David rewound it and played it again. And again. Every word seared into his chest like fire. He copied the tape onto his laptop and emailed it to the sheriff's office without telling his mom. A few minutes later, he grabbed his jacket and disappeared into the night. Angela was back at her desk when the audio file came through. She listened to the full tape, her hands trembling by the end. It confirmed what she and Glenn had suspected: Paul and Miguel hadn't just been killed. They were silenced. They had seen something they weren't supposed to. Something Whitaker might have been part of, or trying to expose himself. Angela slammed her hand down on the desk. "We need to bring in Ray Stokes." Glenn didn't argue. They found Ray at his ranch, quiet and still under the cloudy sky. When Angela asked him to come down to the station, he didn't even pretend to be surprised. He followed them back, silent the whole ride. In the interrogation room, he leaned back in the chair and sighed. "You figured out enough, haven't you?" he said. "More than I thought you would." Angela didn't answer. She just played the tape. Ray closed his eyes when it ended. "It wasn't supposed to go that way," he muttered. "They weren't supposed to die." Glenn leaned forward. "Then who was?" Ray's hand shook as he lit a cigarette. "You don't get it. Back then, it wasn't about greed. It was about keeping people safe. That land wasn't just land. It was part of something bigger. There were weapons tests, military contracts, things that didn't make it to paper. Whitaker and we were supposed to monitor, not interfere. But then someone brought in civilians. Drugs. Money. Paul and Miguel got too close." Angela felt her stomach drop. "And instead of protecting them, you helped cover it up." Ray nodded slowly. "At first, I tried to scare them off. Told them to back down. But they wouldn't. Whitaker said he'd handle it. Said he'd just move them off the board. I didn't know what he meant until it was too late." "And Caleb North?" Glenn asked. Ray's face darkened. "He was a fixer. Not from here. Ex-special ops or something. He came in after the mess. Handled the burial. Shut down the site. Then he vanished. I never saw him again." Angela stood, her fist clenched. "You're telling me you let this happen? You let them be buried and just went on like nothing happened?" Ray looked down. "I thought it was done. But someone's digging again. Someone wants it all to come out." Angela turned toward the hallway, her voice low. "It already is." But even as she said it, her phone buzzed. Another call. Another update. This time from the lab. The man in the new grave, Alan Hurst, had a micro SD card sewn into the cuff of his jacket. Glenn took the card straight to his laptop. The files were encrypted, but one folder opened. Inside were video clips, grainy, black and white surveillance footage. One showed the barn from the outside. Another showed the interior. 3 men arguing. One of them clearly Paul Whitaker. Another could have been Caleb. The third wasn't visible, back turned. But in the clip's final frame, he turned slightly, revealing half his face. Angela froze. It wasn't someone they expected. It was Sheriff Thompson. Not the former one. The current one. Sheriff Michael Thompson, who had taken office just 3 years ago. The man who had reassigned Angela to this case in the first place. The man who told her this was just a cold case from the past. And now he was in the middle of a cover-up that had never ended. The realization hit her like a wave. The case wasn't just historic. It was still alive. Still moving. The past hadn't just returned. It had been watching them the entire time. And now, Angela knew, the most dangerous part was just beginning. Angela sat frozen, staring at the final frame of the video. There was no mistaking the face. Sheriff Michael Thompson, her boss, the man who had reassigned her to the missing persons case with every appearance of concern, was standing inside that barn 16 years ago, alongside Paul Whitaker and the man presumed to be Caleb North. Her breath caught as the pieces rearranged themselves in her mind. He hadn't inherited this investigation. He had been part of the original story, buried deep in it, maybe even directing it. Glenn leaned over her shoulder, staring at the grainy image. "There's no coming back from this," he muttered. "You realize that, right?" Angela nodded. "I'm done waiting for the past to stay buried." They made copies of the files. Backups on USB drives, cloud uploads, even one mailed anonymously to a trusted contact at the State Bureau. Angela wasn't about to make the same mistake others had, going at this alone. As they finished, her phone buzzed again. It was Sophia Reyes. "David's missing," she said, her voice shaking. "He left a note saying he was going to find out the truth, that he couldn't live with not knowing anymore." Angela's gut twisted. She knew exactly where he'd go. The barn. The land that started it all. By the time they reached the site, the sun had just started to rise, casting long shadows through the trees. David's car was parked crooked along the dirt path, the driver's side door flung open. Angela sprinted toward the barn, calling his name. No answer. Inside, the boards creaked under her boots. Dust and rot filled the air. Her flashlight caught fresh footprints in the mud, too recent to ignore. Then a voice echoed from above. "Drop the flashlight, Angela." She froze. Slowly raised her hands. Sheriff Thompson stepped out from the loft, holding a pistol pointed squarely at her. His badge was gone. His eyes were wild. I told myself if anyone got close, I'd end it before it spread again, he said. But I never expected it to be you. Behind him, David stood with his hands tied, his mouth gagged, barely conscious. Glenn raised his own weapon from the shadows of the doorway, but Thompson caught the motion. Don't, he warned. You fire that gun, the whole place goes up. You think this place is just wood and hay? The tank's in the back. They're old. Pressurized. They'll go off like fireworks. Angela's voice was low. Why, Michael? Why were you even there that night? You weren't even sheriff yet. Thompson's expression darkened. Because I was chosen. I was there to clean up. Paul and Miguel, they weren't just deputies. They were messengers. And someone up high didn't like what they were about to deliver. Then why become sheriff? Glenn asked. Why not just leave and let it fade? Because the only way to control a story, Thompson said, is to be the one telling it. Angela took a slow step forward. Let David go. We have everything. We've sent the files. It's over. But Thompson laughed. You think a few blurry videos and a dead deputy are going to bring down the people behind this? I'm not the monster here. I was the only one keeping it quiet enough that no more blood had to be spilled. Behind him, a crack of floorboard snapped. Thompson turned just slightly, enough for David to thrust his bound foot into a weak board, causing a loud crash that momentarily distracted him. It was all the time Glenn needed. He fired once. Thompson spun, dropped his weapon, and staggered backward. He didn't fall. Instead, he stumbled into one of the support beams and yanked something. Angela's eyes widened. A release lever. The floor under them groaned. Then the ground collapsed. Angela dove, grabbing David by the collar just as the wooden platform gave way. Thompson fell through the floor with a sickening thud, slamming into the concrete sublevel beneath the barn. Glenn dropped his flashlight and slid down after him, landing hard. Angela followed, gun drawn, hard hammering. They stood in a space they didn't even know existed, a concrete bunker buried beneath the barn. And what they saw took their breath away. Storage crates, military labels, files, boxes of old equipment, surveillance tapes, maps. This was the heart of the Operation Whitaker and the others had tried to protect or silence. And in the far corner, an old metal chair, its frame bent and rusted, with shackles still bolted to the arms. Thompson lay on the ground, breathing, but barely. Blood pooled under his shoulder. He looked up at Angela, something fading in his eyes. You think they'll let this stay public? He whispered. You're just another name on a list now. Angela leaned in close. Maybe. But I'm not afraid to be the next name. They cuffed Thompson and called it in. By the time backup arrived, the story had already gone out. Journalists were calling. State investigators were en route. Angela and Glenn had submitted everything they had. Sheriff Thompson was officially taken into custody. But even as they stood under the morning sky, watching the barn cordoned off by yellow tape, Angela couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. 3 days later, while reviewing the bunker evidence, Glenn found something strange. One of the storage crates had a false bottom. Beneath it, wrapped in plastic and sealed tight, was a set of documents with federal seals and one burned edge. A partially legible list. Names. Locations. Agencies. One name near the top, Caleb North. Another name, less expected, Paul Whitaker. Angela stared at it in disbelief. He wasn't a whistleblower, she murmured. He was an insider. It hit her like ice. Paul hadn't been trying to bring anything down. He was managing it. The barn, the contracts, the land. But something had gone wrong, Miguel found out. Maybe Paul had a change of heart. Or maybe Miguel confronted him, and it spiraled out of control. Either way, it wasn't just the sheriff's department that had buried secrets. It was Paul, too. And somehow, all of them, Whitaker, North, Thompson, had crossed lines no one was meant to cross. David Reyes came by the station later that week. He looked older, tired, but there was a quiet strength in him. He handed Angela a letter, one his father had written long ago and hidden in a book David hadn't opened until recently. In it, Miguel had written, "If this reaches you, it means I'm gone. But don't let them turn silence into truth. Someone has to keep asking, even if it costs everything." Angela folded the letter and slipped it into her desk drawer. The town of Richland Falls would never be the same. The story made national news. Officials came and went. Investigations opened. The land was seized and marked off as a restricted federal site. A memorial was planned for Paul and Miguel, this time with the full truth engraved in stone. But somewhere out there, in a place not marked on any map, someone watched the news flicker on a small screen. A man with faded tattoos and a scar across his temple. Caleb North was still alive. And the story wasn't over yet. In the weeks that followed, Richland Falls slowly began to settle, though things would never return to what they once were. The barn was demolished after federal investigators confirmed the underground structure had been used as a covert storage and holding site, though the full scope of its purpose remained classified. Despite public outcry, not all files were released. Some were redacted beyond recognition. Still, enough had come to light to vindicate the memories of those who had vanished, Sheriff Whitaker and Deputy Miguel Reyes, and to begin healing a wound the town had carried silently for 16 long years. Angela sat quietly in her office late one evening, watching the sun dip behind the trees outside the sheriff's station. The hum of the vending machine was the only sound in the room. She stared at the framed photo on her desk, an old snapshot of Whitaker and Reyes, arms slung around each other's shoulders in front of the department's original building. It had taken time, but the truth of their disappearance was finally known. They hadn't run. They hadn't betrayed their oath. They had uncovered something dangerous and paid the price for trying to do the right thing. Glenn stepped into her office, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You sure you're okay?" he asked, setting one down beside her. Angela gave a tired smile. "Yeah, just thinking. About Thompson? About all of it," she said. "How close this whole thing came to being forgotten forever. If it weren't for that old outhouse being torn down, no one would have ever found that evidence. We'd still be telling the same old story, 2 officers who disappeared in the night, assumed dead or gone rogue." Glenn nodded. "Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried forever." Thompson was now in federal custody, awaiting trial. The evidence recovered in the bunker had tied him to illegal surveillance, cover-ups, and obstruction of justice. Though he hadn't directly killed Whitaker or Reyes, his role in misleading the investigation and suppressing the truth for years was undeniable. Still, there were questions he refused to answer, especially when it came to Caleb North and the government operation tied to the hidden files. The mystery of Caleb's fate remained unresolved. Some believed he died in the early days of the cleanup. Others, including Angela, weren't so sure. The last surviving photo of him, found among the evidence in the barn, showed a man who knew how to disappear. And if the name on that federal list really belonged to him, it meant he'd been part of something far more complicated than anyone had guessed. A private contractor? A federal informant? Or something else entirely? David Reyes eventually returned to his quiet life, though nothing about him was quite the same. He'd been shaken by how close he came to losing everything in his search for answers. But he'd also gained something clarity about his father's courage and a renewed sense of purpose. He began volunteering with missing persons advocacy groups, quietly helping other families navigate the same silence he'd endured for over a decade. Angela was later offered a position with the state's investigative bureau, recognizing her persistence and bravery throughout the case. But she turned it down. She chose to stay in Richland Falls, to continue serving the community she'd grown up in. "I owe it to them," she told Glenn, "to make sure this town never forgets what happened, or how easy it is for the truth to get buried under convenience." The memorial ceremony for Whitaker and Reyes was held under a soft autumn sky, just outside the old courthouse. Families, friends, and neighbors gathered to pay their respects. A new plaque bore their names and a simple inscription. They served with courage. They sought the truth. Glenn gave a few words, speaking from the heart. Then David stepped forward and read a passage from his father's journal, the same one he'd once been too afraid to open. "My dad used to say, doing the right thing isn't always clean, but it's always worth it. I didn't understand that for a long time, but now I do." Angela watched the crowd, noting how the faces had changed over the years. Some older, some gone. But others, young deputies, high school students, and new families, stood listening, learning from the past. And maybe that was the most important part of all. Not just exposing the truth, but ensuring it stayed alive in the minds of those who came after. Later, while cleaning out one of the storage rooms in the station, Angela found an old file tucked behind a cabinet. It was a weathered envelope addressed to Whitaker, postmarked just days before his disappearance. Inside was a single note, Handwritten, "He's not who he says he is. Watch the barn." The others know. It wasn't signed. Angela stared at it for a long time. Even now, new pieces continued to surface. New layers to a puzzle that had nearly been erased. She slipped it into a new case file, one marked Unresolved Leads. There was still work to do. Always would be. But the difference now was that people were looking. The silence had been broken. The sheriff and the deputy who vanished on night shift had finally been given back their story. And through their story, a small town had learned to stop turning away from the dark corners and start asking the questions no one else dared. For Angela, the case had changed everything. It had cost her sleep, trust, and almost her life. But it had also reminded her why she took the badge in the first place. Not for the uniform, not for the title, but for the people, for the truth, and for those who no longer had voices of their own. And as she walked out into the fading light that evening, the wind soughed through the trees, she knew one thing for certain: the next time something strange happened in Richland Falls, the town wouldn't stay quiet. Not anymore.